Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Last week, I talked to you guys about the X-Files Extended Universe Ruins by Kevin J. Anderson, and this week, I want to pick up where we left off with this book. Today, we are going to talk about a lot of the claims that are made by the characters in the book, including the Mayans inventing the concept of zero, and the history of the United States funding arms races to destabilize other countries, and what that impact has been in the Northern Triangle and the U.S. today. We're also going to talk about the looting of Central American archaeological sites, and discuss how well the first several chapters of this book measure up to the X-Files TV show itself. So in the last episode, we talked about the first few chapters of this book, and at the end of the last chapter that we discussed, there was a section in which the author, or the characters rather, asserted that the Mayans invented the concept of zero. So I was very interested in that, and I wrote it down as soon as I saw it, because although I did go to grad school for anthropology, a Mayan archaeologist I am not. So I Googled this and found a timeline for the origin of zero. And it says that the development of the first concept of zero was found in the Sumerian culture in Mesopotamia about 5,000 years ago. And back then, they used like a double slanted wedge-like symbol in between the cuneiform symbols to represent numbers. And they write that in that position to say, hey, there's not a number here. So if we were to write the number 405, then where our zero would be, that's where they put that slanted double wedge. So kind of like a slanted W, a W in italics, perhaps. So that's what they would put in there, just go, oh hey, there's not a digit in the tens place. And this might seem like it's something that's very small, but it's really important to math. So if you recall, there's an episode of Stargate called The Serpent's Venom, and it never seems to make the top of anyone's list for being in the top 10 favorite episodes. I never see it in there, but it's one of my all-time favorites, and I've watched it more times, possibly, than I have Beneath the Surface, or right about the same. I love a good mind-stamping episode. However, in this situation of this specific episode, Sam and Daniel are working together to try to defuse a bomb, or a mine, really. So it's a Tobin mine that floats around in space, and as it's floating in space, it moves around based on the environment around it, and it's attracted to different things, like a blast from a gold staff weapon. So it has its own internal gravitational engines, and it will move around, or its own sense of inertia, really. And it'll move around and sometimes actively seek out things that it's been programmed to seek out and destroy. And the only place that you can touch this thing, because it is a mine, is on the very bottom where it is programmed. So, in this episode, Jacob, Sam's dad, Selmac, has to fly with the SG-1 team in a Goa'uld ship, a very small one, and so they essentially beam it into the cargo bay, or they use the rings to get it into the cargo bay. And then Jacob has to both pilot the external ship and also keep an eye on the mine inside of the ship with a heads-up display. It's really interesting and it's edge of your seat kind of stuff, but the really cool thing about it to me is that Sam and Daniel get to go full science twins on that. So they're trying to figure out this mine together, and Daniel knows that this society that created this was Phoenician in origin, and the Phoenicians were around from about 4000 BCE when the city of Sidon was founded, and that goes up to about 38 BCE. At which point, a lot of components of the Phoenician civilization had been chopped up and moved under other powers, like some were Roman colonies, some were given to Cleopatra, and so on. So the Phoenicians date to be from 4000 BCE to 38 BCE, before the Common Era. And that's important because when Daniel was interpreting the symbols that they would be looking at on the mine that Jacob and the Tok'ra had gotten a hold of, he was using the Phoenician numerical system as he knew it. And so when he and Sam are slid up underneath this mine like they are working on a car, they are looking at this and Daniel's like, here, I'm exactly sure that this is what the combination is for this Phoenician lock to open up the bomb guts, the mine programming system. And so he tells Sam to go 3 to the blue, 4 to the orange, and then 3 to the blue again. But when she does that, it does not work. Sam tries it again. Daniel makes sure that he's understanding this correctly. And then he also points out the numbers when Sam is like, hey, this thing is going to explode on us in less than a minute if we don't get the right code in there. And so Daniel shows her the book and he goes, look, these are the Tobin numbers. This is 1, this is 2, this is 3. And Sam asks him about 0. And Daniel's like, what are you talking about? The Phoenicians didn't have a 0 in their numerical system. Because for Daniel, this is common knowledge, but it's not for everyone else. And conversely, at that point, Sam is like, this kind of technology, this level of sophistication would require a 0. And when Daniel asks why, Sam goes, just trust me, it's a math thing. But they figure out that they've been off by 1 the whole time, and then they're able to fix it. And I really love that moment because they both have something that they kind of take for granted. Sam knowing about the importance of 0 for advanced technology, and Daniel knowing about the Phoenician numerical system and how they didn't used to have a 0 at a certain point in history. And they both took it for granted, and then they almost exploded each other. But by working together, they figure it out. So my point of this is that in Stargate, they were right about this too. The same thing that they are talking about in this X-Files book. The concept of 0. And although they didn't go into detail about it on Stargate, Sam is right. And that is because the advent of positional notation, where you have numbers in like base 10, like our decimal system, where you have numbers that are one after another and they have place value. So place value notation, that is very important, whether that is base 10 math, like the decimal system, or base 2 math, like binary. They're both forms of positional notation. They're just in a different base. So Sam's right about that. If they were programming something with this advanced level of mathematics and able to seek out all of these different things that it senses, like gold, staff blasts, then it's likely programmed with binary and it would need a 0. So as civilization developed over millennia, truly, we developed this 0. And so the Babylonians had that concept of a zero with that two angled wedges, but the Mayans were the first, at least in the New World, to have discovered this as well. So around 3 BC, which is about 35 years after the fall of the Phoenicians, there was a first recorded zero by the Babylonians around 3 BC. And so that means that Daniel is also technically correct, but the Mayans also independently discovered it around 4 AD, like 9 years after the first invention of it in Mesopotamia, in the rest of the world. That's pretty wild that was only 9 years apart and separately across entire continents. Honestly, there's oceans between them, and it's really cool in my opinion. But they also later got it in India around the mid-5th century, and then it spread to Cambodia near the end of the 7th century, then into China and Islamic countries at the end of the 8th century. Zero actually didn't reach Western Europe until the 12th century. So when we think about the Mayan calendar, it's really not all that surprising that they were making these really great calendars that were so far ahead of the rest of us, because they figured out that zero early on. And it's important to understand the distinction, though, between the mathematical zero and the philosophical concept of nothingness. So nothingness is a concept of just nothing being there. But zero is not just nothingness, it is also a presence in a way. Zero is a thing, whereas nothingness is kind of an unthing. Zero doesn't actually equal nothing, though. So we want to make sure that we have that solid understanding that even if the ancient Sumerians had kind of a concept of it with that empty spot denoted by that sideways kind of W shape, that the Sumerians were there around 5,000 years ago, and they gave rise to the Babylonians when Babylonian culture overtook it several thousand years later, around 1700 BC. So the Babylonians had some components of Sumerian culture in there too, including that wedge shape being used as an actual concept of a zero, instead of just the absence of nothingness. And the Babylonians also had some Akkadian cultural components as well, since they came from that region and the cultures overlapped. They think the Babylonians likely spoke the Akkadian language. And perhaps the merging of these two cultures really is what helped bring us this concept of an actual zero instead of a position of just nothingness. So in this case, both the X-Files book Ruins seems to have gotten it correct, as has Stargate SG-1. So they were coming at this from different perspectives, but it all boils down to the concept of zero in mathematics. The two stories take very different approaches, but I immediately thought of Stargate as soon as they were talking about Mayans inventing the concept of zero. So I thought that was fun, and I wanted to share that with you guys too. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Mulder's visit with the lone gunman and the U.S. history of funding arms races in other countries to perhaps politically destabilize them. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the invention of the concept of zero and positional notation as that relates to this book, Ruins in the X-Files Extended Universe, and also to the Stargate SG-1 episode, The Serpent's Venom. Now we're going to talk about the lone gunman's conversation with Mulder about the U.S. history of funding arms races to destabilize other countries, or providing arms to other countries in exchange for money, and that resulting in the destabilization of the region as one of the contributing factors. So this is relevant because in Chapter 3, Mulder goes to visit the lone gunman to get some more intel on Quintana Roo and Siraclan, and they tell him about a group of freedom fighters called Liberación Quintana Roo, and that the U.S. government is secretly funding that movement by sending them small arms, or selling them small arms, also sending them. But you know what I mean. We're not going to do anything without doing it in exchange for money. We're the United States. And so they're selling these small arms to a freedom fighter movement that's wanting to overthrow their government, and the lone gunmen tell him because it's specifically to create political instability. Now, these are guys who are prone to conspiracy theories. They are Mulder's number one go-to guys to get intel on conspiracy theories. So, I wanted to look it up. I've talked about this in the past with some of my coworkers, but I did a deep dive this week on political instability in the Northern Triangle region of Central America, and that is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And those are located right there in the southern tip of Mexico in Central America. So Quintana Roo is a state in Mexico that is where Cancun is located. And then right below this area of Mexico is the border with Belize, and then the border with Guatemala. And then Guatemala has a border with El Salvador and Honduras. So this story is taking place not too far at all from the Northern Triangle. And so I was researching this and found a little bit about our history there. And I'm just going to give you guys some of the highlights because there is a lot to go through, and I would have to go full Billy Joel, we didn't start the fire, in order to get it out in a pace that would allow me to approximate even that much information. So we're going to do the highlights instead. So first up, we have been interfering for decades with the Central American governments. So in 1954, the CIA conducted a covert operation to overthrow Guatemala's democratically elected president. Now, you can find this information on news articles that are very mainstream, like USA Today. This is not something that is a secret. It's just not often talked about. In the 1980s, the U.S. intervened in El Salvador's civil war. And then in 2009, the Obama administration refused to label the ousting of the Honduras president as a military coup. Soldiers dragged him out of his bed in the middle of the night and exiled him in his pajamas. And this is particularly a problem because this was a democratically elected president. That was President Manuel Zelaya in 2009. And he had some progressive policies. He wanted to raise the minimum wage, subsidize public transportation, etc. And they used a military coup to overthrow him and supplant him with a more conservative administration. In El Salvador, in 2014, the U.S. threatened to withhold about $300 million worth of development aid money unless El Salvador ended their preferences for locally sourced corn and bean seeds under its family agriculture plan. That was in 2014. They were going to withhold development money unless that country turned its back on its people and said, okay, sorry, we're not going to promote this locally sourced corn from our local farmers and these local beans as well when under our country's family agriculture plan. This country is very, very small, and as of 2016 had a negative trade balance of $4.18 billion. And part of that is because it's part of the Dominican Republic Central American Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA-DR, that was made in 2006. And under that model of that agreement, the tariffs on U.S. industrial and commerce goods entering El Salvador are duty-free. So they're not getting paid for us importing those things, and then we blackmailed them with $300 million worth of development aid unless they said that they were going to promote our goods instead of the goods made by their local farmers. So this has made a really impossible condition for the local domestic industries to compete with the American imports. We're already a very rich country, and we're making money hand over fist there, while threatening to withhold development aid, which is meant to help the people in the area in humanitarian ways, to develop the country, to help them advance socioeconomically as well, to stabilize the region. But we were telling them, unless you let us send our stuff in this way and you promote our goods, that we are exporting to you without you being able to collect any type of money for these coming in. And then we wonder why the regions are destabilized and why there are so many immigrants who are coming across the border of Mexico into the U.S. And those are specifically from Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala primarily. It's that northern triangle and also Mexico. Those are the 4 biggest groups that have been found to be migrating across the border. They're running from destabilized regions. Since we are making sure all of our goods go through there duty-free and we're banning them from trying to promote local goods, these people aren't able to make a living wage, and it's just abject poverty in a lot of these areas. There's also the political unrest and the governments that we refuse to say anything about, seemingly except for when we're casting aspersions. So we've sent troops over there. We have plied governments there into making these different decisions. And ultimately, according to experts on Latin American relations, we have done this to the point that since the governments are often very corrupt, it's a situation much like in the U.S. where the rich just get richer. So truthfully, the people we're supporting are corrupt elites, but they're those who make sure that the U.S. still gets their money and that they're getting to keep their other money and, send things through duty-free. So this overall, according to experts on the region, has left Central American governments both weak and fragile, while empowering folks who are rich and who are also involved in gun running, drug cartels, etc., to fuel corruption and gang violence in the area. So we have had a long history of doing this. We're still doing it now, actually. Trump has recently sent guns down south as migrants are still fleeing north. So a couple years back, the United States approved $2 million to $4 million in gun sales per year to Honduras. That was between 2015 and 2017. And that impact on sales in a country that is that small and that has a largely poor population is potentially devastating. There have been a lot of changes that have taken place in the area over the past decade or so that have been attempts to try to stabilize it, but much like the coup from 2009 in Honduras, El Salvador is also having trouble getting to the point where this is not going to be that devastating. And there are people who are having to flee every year too. So the population is also shrinking due to corruption, due to gun violence, due to overstuffed prisons in the Triangle as more and more people are arrested by corrupt regimes, so they aren't necessarily even the people that you want arrested, like the cartels. And it all makes for this perfect storm, both as a factor for our story, Ruins, and also in real life. In real life, we have so many people trying to cross the border in fleeing from these gangs and warfare and corrupt governments and poverty that they are dying en masse on the border. They die from exhaustion, they die from exposure, and from dehydration. They may also die from encounters with others that are out to harm them. And the number of them is staggering. Between 2013 and 2014, over 297 migrants perished on these border counties between the U.S. and Mexico at the Texas border. And those are just the ones that were recovered by Operation Identification. That is a collaborative effort between governmental and non-governmental organizations to recover the remains of these people and then identify them and hopefully give them back to their families so that they can get some closure in what happened to their loved one. And that unknowing is relevant both to Operation Identification's efforts as well as that of Scully and Mulder as they help Dr. Rubicon search for his daughter in the Mayan jungles and as Mulder searches for his own sister, Samantha. So we'll touch on that more in our next segment. We're going to go on a brief break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about political instability in South America as that relates to the current migrant crisis, Operation Identification, and Mulder and Scully's trip to the Yucatan Peninsula. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the Northern Triangle, the area in Central America of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, which is the little bridgy chunk that is at the tip of Mexico. Belize is also down there, up there bordering Quintana Roo, but it is separate from those countries in the triangle and is also not one of the top countries as that relates to migration across the border between Central America and the United States. Over the years, as we discussed in our last segment, people have been leaving those areas and migrating north towards the United States because there are corrupt governments that lead to more corruption and gang violence and associations with criminal organizations. And in some cases, if you have a child, your child may be told that they have to join the local gang when they get to a certain age, and if they don't, that they are going to be killed. And these aren't idle threats. And so they send their children over the borders into the U.S. A lot of researchers and policymakers who are studying Latin America and the migrant crisis we've been facing over the years are also saying the same thing. When combined with the information from the historians about the U.S.'s direct involvement in their policies and their governments, and also our personal policies about receiving migrants in North America as refugees and asylum seekers, we have caused some problems down in the region. And it doesn't mean that the U.S. is necessarily solely responsible for this, as the director of the Mexico Security Initiative at the University of Texas, Austin, Stephanie Lutert, said it's one factor of many. So she states that the other dynamics, like the birth of the MS-13 gang in Los Angeles, to just the huge plummet in world coffee prices, have also sparked the migration crisis. If you're not aware, the coffee market collapsed a while back, and that has made it almost impossible for people who are farming coffee or growing coffee in Central America to make any money. A lot of them are actually operating at a net loss. The president of a coffee producers group in Guatemala, Ricardo Arenas Mendez, said that this poverty from market forces is also causing people to immigrate to North America. In Honduras alone, the president there said that 90,000 small coffee producers in his country are now in extreme poverty because of this coffee market crash. And on average, a cup of coffee might be $5 in New York, but that really means about 2 cents are getting to the coffee producers in Honduras. And that's partly due to the agreements made under CAFTA regarding the U.S.'s import and export taxes with these Central American governments. That doesn't mean that it's a direct cause and the sole cause, but it is a striking component in this puzzle of what's going on in the Central American region of the Northern Triangle that is causing so many people from specifically those nations to be trying to immigrate over the Mexico-U.S. border. Part of it's also geography. So the drug trade is one of the major drivers of instability and violence in that area, and that's what's leading to more corruption too. So all three of those countries in the triangle are shipment points for cocaine and other drugs that are smuggled into the U.S. So we really like our drugs in the U.S. apparently. We are one of the top consuming countries of drugs, and El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, since they are part of that plug between the beginning of South America and the tip of Mexico in Central America, they are a stop on the way for a lot of drug shipments that are smuggled into the U.S. Additionally, the Honduran president, Hernandez, was reelected in November 2017, and a lot of folks said that vote was tainted by fraud. And there were protesters all around the country who were marching in opposition to this. So his first term had been really violent. There had been a lot of violent crime, a lot of corruption, and they really did not want him reelected. So in the following days, the military police started to fire U.S.-made M4 rifles on the protesters. They wounded hundreds and killed more than 30 people in 2017. If you aren't familiar with the M4 rifle, it's the military version of an AR-15. And the U.S. provides more small arms and ammo to Central America than any other country supplies. The market in that region also expanded under Obama's rule. This is not a Democrat or Republican thing. This is just straight up U.S. history, y'all. And according to customs data collected by the United Nations Comtrade Program, the market in that region looks like it's going to continue to expand under Trump as well. So these look like really small transactions when compared with others. So this is only $2 to $4 million in gun sales, as we discussed earlier. But again, these are really small countries. So sure, we also sell a lot of guns to Saudi Arabia, multi-billion dollars of guns to Saudi Arabia. And Honduras is only getting $2 million to $4 million worth of them between 2015 and 2017. But in such small areas and in such poor areas, that can be a big deciding factor in maintaining corruption, especially if you have an already corrupt government. Some political scientists, like Mark Ungar at Brooklyn College, tend to focus on a specific region, and he looks at corruption, gangs, and arms trafficking specifically in Central America. And he says that in that region, there's no illusion of difference between the state and organized crime, because the corruption is so virulent. And if you'd like to read more about that, you can also check out the Congressional Research Service reports. There's one from July 22nd, 2019 called Honduras, Background and U.S. Relations by Peter J. Meyer, who is a specialist in Latin American affairs. It's only about 30 pages or so, and if you would like to check that out, it's an actual congressional report and tells you all about the policies over the years. Our government knows that they're doing this. They're very aware, and a lot of what I have discussed with you guys today came directly from these government documents, like that Congressional Research Service report, and that's just available online, freely. If you go to everycrsreport.com, then you can find these reports. Overall, though, the U.S. has a long history of interfering in the Central American governments, whether that be by selling arms down there to corrupt governments who are in a spider's web with these cartels and all these other criminal organizations and the local police forces and the military, to the point that life is very unstable and unsafe in those regions, and it also culminates in a lot of migration to the U.S. as people flee the region as refugees and asylum seekers. Operation Identification goes out at least twice a year to recover the remains of individuals who have died crossing the border, and when they go out there, they take them back to the Forensic Anthropology Center at Texas State University and perform analyses on them to help find them. Now, they work specifically with about 5 or 6 counties in the South Texas region in the Rio Grande Valley, and they also cooperate with a lot of other humanitarian and identification groups. They do a lot of great work. I know many of them personally and have helped with some exhumations before, and they're a great organization. They are underfunded, though. So if you are interested in helping give these folks their names back and returning their bodies to their family members so their families can get a sense of closure by laying their loved one to rest, then I recommend checking out Operation Identification. That's Operation Identification at Texas State University. And Dr. Kate Spradley is the forensic anthropologist who heads that group. You can find out more about Operation Identification by Googling Operation Identification Texas, and the first link that pops up should be www.texstate.edu, and it'll say Operation Identification Texas State University. That'll take you to a webpage with a donation button at the bottom if you would like to support the identification efforts and the funding for this organization, which is largely made up of volunteer graduate students. Now that we know about the sociopolitical history of the United States' involvement in Latin America, we can discuss more what this means in the context of the story, as these type of freedom fighter movements and militaristic coups and drug cartels are going to be a big part of this story as well. It is firmly grounded in reality and is unfortunately ongoing. So this is just as relevant in 2020 as it was in 1996 when this book came out. Now that might not feel like that long ago, but at this point, that was 14 years ago. So if you're my age, you're in your 30s, your early 30s, then that's about half your life ago. Both very recently and very long ago, and it's unfortunately still incredibly relevant. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about some of the characters that fulfill these roles of corruption within our story as it relates to the themes we just discussed of historical events in Latin America. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how instability in the Northern Triangle, partially spurred on by U.S. involvement in selling firearms to the region, and partly due to socioeconomic policies like CAFTA and general corruption, have led to the migrant crisis we see in the United States today, stemming from the Northern Triangle area, and how, in that way, Ruins is still just as relevant 14 years later as it was when it came out in 1996, and as it was for decades before that, as our involvement is quite far-reaching. Now that we've laid the groundwork for this, historically, we are going to talk about some of the other characters in the book. So, in the book, we're able to see that there are other characters with a stake in Citaclan and what they want from it. So UC San Diego wants it to be excavated, or at least this group of students do, and that's where they procured their funding. And the state of Quintana Roo also matched that funding from UC San Diego to help them find out as much as they could about the area. However, other stakeholders are Scully and Mulder, who don't care so much about the ruins themselves, or at least Scully doesn't, as they do helping find the woman who was leading the archaeological expedition, Cassandra Rubicon, because her father, Vladimir Rubicon, has also asked them to help out. So those are our main stakeholders, but we also get to see what essentially the villains of the story are up to. So we have these other characters, Fernando Victorio Aguilar, and we've discussed him previously because he's who initially was supposed to have led the archaeological team into the jungle. So at this point in the story, we know that Cassandra has been consumed by this very bright light and has seemingly lost consciousness, or at least we're no longer able to follow her part of the story. And she had been chased through the ruins by men with large firearms. So, that's probably what happened to her compatriots. They were likely taken by force by these guys who had these large arms, but we didn't precisely know what those folks were there for. And whether they kept Cassandra's friends alive is anyone's guess. I'm going to say that I really doubt that they kept them alive. They probably killed them. Considering their blind firing at Cassandra, I doubt that they really cared one way or another what happened to those folks, especially since they were already so far out in the jungle. So all those folks are missing, and Fernando had previously ran out of the jungle, but now when we catch up with him, he is chilling in a police car in the front seat, super relaxed. He's clearly not uncomfortable in any way, and is just chilling in this car with the chief of police, Quintana Roo's chief of their state police, Carlos Barreo. So the police chief, Carlos, and Fernando are hanging out in the car, and there's a guy in the back too. And his name is Pepe Candelaria. And Pepe is a young man who is a local native to the area, and they describe him as being a young Indian. So I take that to mean that he has a lot of indigenous blood to the native populations of the area, especially considering the other information they provide for us about Pepe as things go along. And in this chapter, the three of them have this big old box in the back seat of the police car that Pepe's guarding, and they're going to this very grand mansion that this drug cartel leader owns. And his name is Javier Salida. And so Javier Salida is very, very rich, but he also really likes Mayan architecture. Our main characters of the villains, Fernando Victorio primarily, thinks that it's because he just likes to look cultured and smart because of an insecurity of growing up poor and illiterate, and then funding his literacy efforts with his drug money. So on the one hand, total come up. But that's what Fernando Victorio says is the reason that Javier Salida does this. And that's the impression that you're supposed to get as the reader as well. So they are trying to convince this man to pay them some exorbitant sum of money for a new artifact that they have pulled from Cetaclon. And they say that the American archaeological team that was there, Cassandra's team, is no longer going to be a problem. And that they do need to hurry and get all of the other meaningful artifacts, when it comes to money, out of there before the Americans send another archaeological team in. The item that Fernando has with him this time is a crystal box. It's incredibly clear, and it almost seems like it might be some sort of almost mechanical clock. Whatever it is, it's very beautiful and unlike anything they've recovered from another Mayan site. In fact, this is a very strange object archaeologically in general, especially for that region. So Fernando Aguilar really doesn't know much more about these items than Javier Salida does. But Fernando Aguilar has been doing this for years, so he is not that pressed about it. He's decided that he's going to just say what he needs to say to manipulate this man into giving him more money. He doesn't actually care about the actual story, because the actual story doesn't matter. Only the money does. So they make this deal, and they make a bunch of money off of this trade, And when they leave, they stop at the end of the road and tell Pepe to hike 1 to 2 days through the jungle with nothing but his machete and some pesos to go back and get more archaeological artifacts, that they need more of these ASAP because this is one of the highest prices they have ever fetched for any of the artifacts and pieces of the ruins that they brought back, including giant stone carvings that weigh thousands of pounds. So you can see that they don't really hold Pepe in high regard at all, and the two of them then drive off and go to Cancun to spend their money. And that's where we leave them. We don't know what they spend their money on. I'm sure we can guess. It's implied. But they go to Cancun to spend some of their money now, because they just are used to making this money hand over fist. But this is an exceptional deal that they have really capitalized on. So it's cause for celebration, just without Pepe. And honestly, this is not that uncommon at all. Central American archaeological sites have often been looted over the years. And that's something that they do cover in the book from many aspects. Cassandra kind of bemoans the fact that many Mayan ruins have been known for several years, and so a lot of them have been touched by looters, as have archaeological ruins all over the world, like those in Greece or in Tuscany. And she says that kind of the magic of the jungle there in the Yucatan is that many of these ruins are likely out there, probably thousands of them, that haven't been seen because the forest kind of swallows everything. The jungle just swallows everything and you can't see them. And people aren't wanting to just go out in the jungle for the most part to hope they stumble upon some ruins. It can be kind of a dangerous place out there. So a lot of these places might exist and just not be discovered yet. And she's right. But also, she's right that a lot of these places that are well known have been looted. In Guatemala in particular, they have some really large pyramidal mounds, and they are often looted. For example, the Mayan city of Sultun is mostly hidden beneath a lot of heavy vegetation and some rolling hills, but there are also tunnels in the side of the hills that have been used by antiquity looters. Huecheros is what they call them. It's from the Mayan word for armadillo, and they will go through and loot these tombs, loot these historical sites, because they aren't all tombs. But the city is very large, and almost every one of the pyramids in the site has a tunnel that looters have used on at least one side of it. They have taken hieroglyphic panels, pottery, jade, which is an abundant gemstone in the area around there, and they also discuss that in the book. But there's a reason people keep doing this. It's not just for the lulz or so they can have these artifacts. It's because they fetch a lot of money. So there is an international trade in Mayan antiquities, and it happens largely across that region. It spread through the 80s and 90s and scraped away a lot of the information that modern archaeologists use to try to understand the people who live there. What did they eat? What did they do for fun? How did they live? What were their technological advancements? A lot of that is removed when the context of the site is disturbed. So even if things are moved out of their context, so if the grave robbers went in and then just didn't do anything other than maybe stack rocks like people do when they go to the river, that's still disturbing the site, because now archaeologists can't see these things in situ how they were before when the Maya sat down that bowl for the last time or put down that jade shape for the last time. It destroys that snapshot of life, just like stacking rocks in riparian environments when you're near rivers means that you are likely destroying the environments for some creatures like the hellbender salamanders. So disturbing those, stacking rocks is bad, both in messing up archaeological sites and when you go to the river. Just don't stack rocks, you guys. The context gets ruined either way, and that looting is still continuing today. So it's at a lower rate than it was in the 80s and 90s, partly because there are fewer things to loot now. The ones that are closer to modern civilizations, the ones that are easier to reach by these roads have already been looted. So the rate is going to be lower. This is not a renewable resource. Archaeological remains, that is, and at least not really in our timeline. It's not like archaeologists are going, okay, I'm only digging up stuff to the year 101 BCE, and then I'm going to stop. And then next year I can go down to 100 BCE. That's not the way it works. So sure, the houses we live in today are the future's archaeological ruins, but that doesn't mean anything for looters or for archaeologists when it comes to the things that are valuable today because they're ancient. The things that will be valuable to archaeologists that we have now won't be valuable in that way for probably hundreds of more years, depending on whether you do historic archaeology or archaeology that's a bit further back. And this didn't start with recent looters. The antiquity trade began around the Spanish conquest. So with the introduction of colonization by Europeans to the area really began that antiquity trade. And these artifacts really can fetch quite a lot of money, especially as they become more and more rare, as we run out of these sites to excavate or to loot. And I like that Ruins makes the point of making these looters one of the main villains of the story. Sure, we have a guy who is the leader of a drug cartel as one of our characters, and a corrupt local police chief who is also funding his pet project, Liberación Quintana Roo, the freedom fighter movement to overthrow the government. And we're not sure how stable that government is to begin with. Are we to suppose it is the government of our 1996? Or is it a different government of 1996? Are they more conservative? Are they more liberal? Are they rigging the elections at this point? Is Carlos morally justified in trying to take down this regime? Considering who he's working with, it would seem not. It would seem that he might be more likely to be a corrupt agent of the government and want to take over the government just to supplant it with his own brand of corruption. It seems like that more so than him wanting to fix anything, to be honest, but I suppose we'll find out more about Carlos as we move along. I am excited, though, to see these components of the corruption in the government, the local cartels, and the antiquities trades, and how these are all intertwined along with the involvement of the U.S. government in this destabilization of the region, and to really form this idea of who and what a villain is, especially in the X-Files universe. This is a great place for it, because Mulder is a Fed, but Mulder does not trust the Feds. Mulder trusts no one except for Scully. So in that way, even though he's a Fed, he also is not a big fan of big government and believes that most people and most governments are corrupt. So this might seem like a bit of a departure since it's dealing with a different government. This isn't about the Syndicate or the American shadow government. It's about Central America. And the X-Files largely focuses on the Anasazi, but we get to now focus on the Maya in South America. There are a lot of parallels, but also Kevin J. Anderson does a great job with his departures from them. There are very clean lines that say, hey, this is definitely an X-Files book. They have a lot of really great dry banter and humor going back and forth. And he has a good grasp of the characters, but I also enjoy his original characters so far, and how we're getting a sense of them through each other. I think that it's well written, and I'm excited to see where it goes. In our next episode, we will see Scully and Mulder meeting Dr. Rubicon and flying down to Central America with him to help find Cassandra, and we may also talk a bit about regression hypnosis. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.